Winter did not stop medieval construction. It sharpened it. When the ground froze and daylight shrank, castles did not wait for spring. Power could not afford patience. Borders were unstable, enemies unpredictable, and unfinished walls invited disaster. In the medieval world, a castle left incomplete was not a project delayed. It was a weakness exposed. So construction continued, even when breath turned to frost and stone burned the skin. Building a castle in winter was not an act of defiance against nature. It was an act of control over people. Medieval lords understood that winter slowed armies, not labor. Peasants were already trapped by obligation. Fields lay dormant. Food stores were controlled by those who ruled. Winter became an opportunity to extract work when survival depended entirely on obedience. Labor did not stop when the temperature fell. It intensified. The first challenge was the ground itself. Frozen earth could not be dug with ordinary tools. Trenches for foundations had to be broken open with iron picks, fire, and brute force. In some regions, builders lit fires directly on the ground to soften the soil, then hacked through the thawed surface before it refroze. This was slow, exhausting, and relentless work. Men labored in shifts, rotating not for comfort but because bodies failed. Hands cracked, fingers numbed. Blood froze quickly when skin split. There was no concept of safety. Injury was expected. Replacement was easy. Stonework did not pause. Quarries operated year-round when possible. In winter, stone was harder to extract but easier to transport. Snow flattened roads. Frozen ground supported heavy loads that would sink in mud during warmer months. Sledges replaced carts. Oxen dragged enormous blocks across ice and packed snow. Winter made movement efficient. It made people expendable. Mortar posed a greater problem. Traditional lime mortar required specific conditions to cure properly. Freezing temperatures could weaken bonds, causing walls to fail later. Medieval builders adapted. They altered mixtures, added organic materials, used thicker joints, and in some cases delayed final finishing until spring. Speed mattered more than perfection. Walls raised in winter were often rough, unfinished shells. The goal was height, not beauty. Even an incomplete wall could deter attack. Even a flawed tower could signal dominance. Castles were statements before they were structures. Inside the construction sites, winter created a hierarchy of suffering. Skilled masons were protected as investments. They received better shelter, warmer clothing, and priority access to food. Their knowledge was valuable. Losing them slowed progress. Unskilled laborers were not protected. These workers hauled stone, mixed mortar, cleared snow, and carried water that froze in buckets before reaching its destination. Many were peasants fulfilling forced labor obligations. Others were prisoners, debtors, or men with no alternatives. Their contracts were not written. They were enforced by hunger. Shelter was minimal. Temporary huts of wood and straw offered little protection from wind. Fires burned constantly, not for comfort, but to prevent death. Smoke filled enclosed spaces. Lungs suffered. Eyes burned. Illness spread quickly. Winter weakened immune systems. Malnutrition was common. Infections that might be survivable in summer became lethal. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Those who could no longer work were dismissed, abandoned, or reassigned to lighter tasks until they failed completely. Death was not dramatic. It was administrative. Construction schedules did not pause for funerals. Records from medieval estates rarely mention these deaths. They were expected losses, absorbed into the cost of building. Stone endured, people did not. Time itself was an enemy. Winter days were short. Work began before sunrise and ended in darkness. Torches illuminated scaffolding, casting long shadows across rising walls. Accidents increased. Falls were common. A slip on ice from height meant death. Bodies were removed quickly. Work resumed. Supply chains strained under winter conditions. Food had to be transported through snow and ice. Delays caused hunger. Hunger caused weakness. Weakness slowed work. Lords responded not by reducing demands, but by increasing pressure. Punishment replaced motivation. Supervisors enforced quotas through violence. Beatings were common. Desertion was punished publicly to deter others. Winter trapped workers geographically. Snow made escape difficult. Cold made hiding impossible. The castle rose while resistance froze. Water was another constant challenge. Mortar, food preparation, and basic survival required liquid water. In winter, it had to be broken from ice daily. Wells froze. Buckets shattered. Laborers spent hours simply keeping water usable. This labor did not build walls. It sustained the ability to build walls. Fire became central to construction. Kilns burned continuously to produce lime. Wood consumption increased dramatically. Entire forests were stripped to feed construction through winter. Environmental cost was immediate. Long-term damage was irrelevant. The castle mattered. The land could recover later. Winter also shaped design choices. Some architectural decisions were influenced directly by cold weather construction. Thicker walls retained heat during building and later occupation. Narrow openings reduced wind exposure. Temporary wooden structures were incorporated into permanent designs. What began as adaptation became tradition. There was also urgency. Winter construction often coincided with political instability. A lord building in winter was signaling something: fear of rebellion, expectation of war, assertion of dominance during a season when others slowed down. To build in winter was to declare seriousness. Enemies noticed. The presence of rising walls, even unfinished, altered regional power dynamics. Villages were forced to supply labor and food. Roads were controlled. The castle reshaped the landscape before it was complete. All of this was accomplished through endurance extracted from human bodies. No one romanticized this work at the time. There were no myths of noble builders braving the cold. There were obligations, punishments, and survival. Winter construction was not heroic. It was coercive, and it worked. Castles built through winter stood for centuries. Their stones outlived the names of those who froze lifting them. Their walls absorbed suffering without record. Today, when we see medieval castles rising from snowy landscapes, we imagine resilience, ingenuity, determination. What we rarely imagine is cost. The winter castle was not a triumph over nature. It was a demonstration of power over people. And as the walls rose against the cold, so did a truth that defined the medieval world. Stone was permanent, human endurance was assumed, and winter was not an obstacle. It was a tool. Winter construction did not rely on endurance alone. It relied on systems. Behind every stone lifted in freezing temperatures stood an organized structure of control that made winter building possible. Castles were not built by spontaneous effort. They were built by obligation, logistics, and fear, carefully coordinated to function even when nature resisted. Labor was gathered long before the first snowfall. Medieval lords planned winter construction deliberately. Villages were assigned quotas. Each household owed days or weeks of work, known as corvée labor. Refusal was not an option. These obligations were enforced through law, punishment, and the threat of starvation. Winter was chosen precisely because peasants had fewer alternatives. Fields lay dormant. Travel was limited. Dependency was total. This made winter the ideal season to extract labor. Workers arrived at construction sites already weakened. Food supplies were tight during winter months, and rations were controlled by those in power. Hunger kept laborers compliant. A fed worker could resist. A hungry one could not. Payment, when it existed, was symbolic. Most winter laborers were not paid wages. They were fulfilling duties or paying debts. Prisoners and convicts were common. So were men whose land had failed, whose families depended on compliance for survival. The castle fed them just enough to keep them alive. Organization on site was rigid. Construction zones were divided into tasks: quarrying, transport, masonry, mortar mixing, scaffolding, fire maintenance, water collection. Each task had overseers. Overseers answered to masters. Masters answered to the lord or his appointed officials. Violence enforced efficiency. Beatings were routine, not for cruelty but correction. A slow worker endangered schedules. A mistake wasted material. In winter, wasted time meant frozen mortar, collapsed scaffolding, and failure. Punishment was immediate and public. Skilled craftsmen occupied a protected layer within this system. Master masons, engineers, and carpenters were valuable. Their knowledge could not be replaced easily. They were given better shelter, warmer clothing, and priority food. Their survival mattered to the project. This division bred resentment, but resentment had nowhere to go. Unskilled laborers absorbed the worst conditions. They carried stone with numb hands. They stood waist-deep in snow mixing mortar. They climbed icy scaffolding in darkness. Many worked without gloves because gloves reduced grip. Fingers stiffened, muscles tore, bones broke. Winter magnified every risk. Scaffolding iced over. Ropes stiffened and snapped. Wooden beams cracked in extreme cold. Falls were frequent and fatal. There were no safety nets, no compensation. A body removed from the base of a wall was replaced within hours. Construction did not pause. Fire became the most important tool on site. Fires thawed ground, heated water, kept mortar usable, and prevented death during short breaks. Firewood consumption skyrocketed. Forests surrounding castle sites were stripped rapidly. Entire landscapes were altered to keep construction alive through winter. Environmental cost was irrelevant. Power was immediate. Kilns burned day and night to produce lime. The heat was intense, creating pockets of warmth surrounded by deadly cold. Workers moved between extremes, shocking the body repeatedly. Illness followed. Pneumonia and infections spread. Those who fell sick were liabilities. A sick worker could not meet quotas. He slowed teams. He consumed food. Many were dismissed and sent away, knowing full well they would not survive the journey home. Others were kept working until they collapsed. Death did not interrupt progress. Winter also altered how castles were built. Design choices were influenced by the need to keep construction moving. Walls were raised thick and fast. Precision was sacrificed for speed. Decorative elements were postponed. Openings were minimized to block wind. Temporary wooden structures became permanent solutions. What began as winter adaptation shaped long-term architecture. In some cases, entire sections were built as shells, with interiors left unfinished until warmer seasons. The exterior mattered most. Height mattered. Visibility mattered. A half-built castle still projected dominance. Winter construction sent a message. It told rivals that resources were abundant, that labor was controlled. That delay was unnecessary. To build in winter was to demonstrate authority not just over land, but over time and hardship. Villages understood this message clearly. They watched walls rise while their own homes struggled against cold. They supplied food, labor, and materials while surviving on scarcity. Resistance was dangerous. Rebellion in winter was suicidal. Snow buried dissent. By the time spring arrived, the castle already stood above the landscape. Walls were in place, towers visible for miles. The most dangerous phase of construction was complete. Winter had done its work, not by defeating nature, but by exploiting human vulnerability. And yet, winter construction was still not finished business. Because the final cost of building castles in the cold was not paid in stone, wood, or lime. It was paid in memory. The names of those who froze, fell, or collapsed were never recorded. Their deaths were absorbed into progress. Their absence explained nothing. What remained were walls. And those walls would shape centuries of power, conflict, and control. But to understand the full meaning of winter construction, we must look beyond logistics and labor. We must look at why lords were willing to accept such costs in the first place. Because winter building was not just about finishing castles faster. It was about ensuring obedience lasted longer than the cold. Winter construction left marks that lasted far longer than the cold. By the time spring arrived, the most dangerous work was already done. Walls stood tall. Towers dominated the landscape. What remained were interiors, refinements, details. The castle had crossed its most important threshold: visibility. It no longer needed to be finished to exert power. It needed only to exist, and that existence was built on endurance taken from others. The people who survived winter construction returned home changed. Some returned missing fingers, toes, or entire limbs lost to frostbite. Others carried injuries from falls or crushed bones that never healed properly. Many brought illnesses that spread through villages already weakened by scarcity. Winter building did not end at the castle walls. Its consequences radiated outward. Communities absorbed the cost quietly. There were no commemorations for the dead, no compensation for families. Loss was treated as inevitable, a byproduct of duty. To question it was to question authority itself, and authority did not tolerate questions. Over time, memory faded. The names of the workers disappeared first, then the stories, then even the acknowledgement that suffering had occurred. What remained was stone clean, solid, impressive. The castle stood as proof of strength, not of cost. This transformation was intentional. Medieval power depended on permanence. Castles were meant to outlast generations, to anchor authority in the landscape itself. By forcing construction through winter, lords accelerated this process. They shortened the window in which opposition could form. Speed mattered more than lives. Winter building also reshaped how people understood obedience. It taught communities that resistance had seasons and winter was not one of them. Hunger, cold, and dependency made defiance impossible. Authority learned that control was easiest when nature was harshest. This lesson endured. Later generations inherited castles whose origins were already obscured. They saw walls, not workers. They admired engineering, not exhaustion. Winter construction became a footnote, if it was remembered at all. Romantic narratives replaced reality. Castles were reimagined as symbols of resilience and ingenuity. Harsh winters became challenges overcome by clever design and human determination. The coercion disappeared from the story. The suffering became invisible, but the architecture still tells the truth. Thick walls built quickly. Rough stone hidden behind later refinements. Structural compromises made for speed. Temporary solutions turned permanent. Winter left fingerprints everywhere for those who know how to look. Even the placement of castles reveals it. Many were built to dominate supply routes and villages that had fed their construction. The same communities that labored in winter became subjects year-round. The castle they built stood over them, enforcing obedience long after the cold had passed. Winter did not weaken authority. It strengthened it, and that was the point. To build in winter was not reckless. It was calculated. It leveraged scarcity, fear, and dependency to extract maximum effort with minimal resistance. Nature became an ally in control. This is why winter construction persisted despite the cost. Because it worked. Castles built through winter stood faster, intimidated sooner, and stabilized power earlier. Lords accepted casualties because casualties were anonymous. Stone endured. People did not. Today, when we walk through medieval castles in winter, snow collecting on battlements and towers, the scene feels timeless, peaceful, almost noble. But those walls were never neutral. They were raised through frozen hands, controlled hunger, and enforced silence. They are monuments not just to engineering, but to a system that understood how to turn hardship into obedience. Winter was not an obstacle to medieval power. It was a weapon. And every stone laid in the cold carries that legacy. Because castles were not built to withstand weather. They were built to withstand people. And winter ensured they would.